"Get away from here and wait outside. You have no business being here." The words rang out like a sharp, metallic echo in the otherwise silent terminal. It was the kind of phrase that was often accompanied by condescension and power, a subtle threat draped in privilege. But on this day, it was aimed at a man who was about to turn the tables on the very system that had been built to exclude him. The voice came from a flight attendant, dressed in a polished uniform that gleamed with authority. Her words were not directed at just any passenger, they were aimed at one of the most powerful men in the world of private aviation. But what the flight attendant didn't know was that the man she was humiliating was not just another customer. He was the CEO of one of the largest private jet companies in the world, an empire built on precision, luxury, and billions of dollars in revenue. Before we continue, if you believe that everyone should be treated with respect, regardless of their background, hit that subscribe button, type support in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. Marcus Bennett was 42 years old, a billionaire, a visionary, and a leader in the aviation industry. His name might not be as well known in the public eye as other business tycoons, but within the world of private jets and aviation services, his reputation was untouchable. The company he had built from the ground up, Jet Legacy Aviation, was known for providing bespoke services to the world's wealthiest individuals. But what set Marcus apart from other moguls was his deliberate choice to stay out of the spotlight. No social media accounts, no interviews, no media appearances. His personal life was as private as the jets his company operated. Despite his wealth, Marcus believed in discretion, avoiding the fame that came with owning a fortune. The world may have known his company's name, but few had ever seen the man behind it. Just the day before, Marcus had been in Geneva, finalizing a multi-billion-dollar deal for a new fleet of private jets that would revolutionize the luxury aviation market. He had been up all night, going through the details with his board members, checking every clause, every figure, making sure that everything was in place. The deal was massive, $3 billion, securing Jet Legacy's dominance in the market. For years to come, it was the kind of deal that marked a milestone in any CEO's career. But now, here he was, back at Westchester County Airport, just hours away from boarding his personal jet to the Hamptons for a family celebration. It was his father's 75th birthday, and he had promised to be there to celebrate. Yet, as he approached the entrance to his company's private lounge at the airport, the confrontation began. The flight attendant's dismissive tone caught Marcus off guard. "Excuse me, sir, this lounge is for first-class passengers only. You'll need to show me your boarding pass and identification," she said sharply, blocking his way. It wasn't unusual for passengers to be asked for identification, but there was something about her tone that felt different. Marcus paused for a moment, processing her words. He had been a loyal customer of this lounge for over a decade. His membership was platinum, and his credentials were without question. But the attendant's tone was not just rude, it was accusatory. He reached into his jacket and handed her his boarding pass and identification, expecting this to be a routine exchange. Instead, the attendant barely glanced at the documents, her skepticism evident. "These don't look right," she announced loudly, enough for other passengers to hear. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm going to have to ask you to wait outside while I verify your credentials." Marcus stood frozen for a moment, disbelief creeping into his expression. "Excuse me? I've been a member of this lounge for over 10 years. My credentials are perfectly in order," he said, trying to remain calm. But the attendant was unmoved. She turned her back to him, continuing her loud proclamation that his credentials were somehow suspicious. As he stood there, processing what was happening, other passengers, white, affluent-looking individuals, walked past without a second glance. Their boarding passes were accepted without question. In fact, the attendant seemed almost eager to accommodate them, offering them smiles and polite nods. It became clear in that moment, the very people who could afford to fly privately, those who belonged in the most exclusive spaces, were being treated differently based purely on their appearance. It wasn't about money, it was about who they thought looked like they belonged. Marcus was being subjected to the same old assumptions that so many others in his position had faced. His wealth, his status, none of that mattered in the eyes of this gatekeeper. What mattered was how they perceived him, how he looked. "Sir, I'm going to need you to wait outside," the attendant repeated, this time with an added edge of authority. "This is an exclusive lounge for our highest tier clients. I can't let anyone in without proper verification." Marcus stood there for several minutes, the weight of the situation slowly settling in. Rain began to fall through the high glass ceiling of the terminal, and the irony of it all was not lost on him. He was being kept outside in the rain while others, who did not have his credentials, were being allowed in with no scrutiny whatsoever. The feeling of humiliation began to sink in. But it wasn't because of the rain or the discomfort, it was because of the blatant racial profiling that was happening before his very eyes. He had seen it happen to others, but he never thought it would happen to him, not in his own company, not in a space he had helped build. As the rain poured down and Marcus stood alone in the terminal, the reality of the situation began to crystallize. This wasn't just a case of one rude employee. This was a systemic issue. This was a culture of discrimination that had been allowed to fester unchecked for far too long. And in that moment, Marcus knew exactly what he had to do. He took out his phone, dialing the number of his executive assistant. He was done waiting. He wasn't going to be humiliated any longer. He wasn't going to allow this toxic culture to continue. "This is Marcus Bennett," he said, his voice calm, but with a quiet fury beneath the surface. "Cancel all meetings for the rest of the day. I need to speak to the board, and I need security footage from the last hour at Westchester. I want a full review of every employee who's been involved in this incident." The assistant, though startled, replied immediately, "Of course, Mr. Bennett. We'll take care of everything." As he ended the call, Marcus stood tall. He was no longer just a passenger. He was the CEO, and it was time to make some serious changes. No more playing by the rules that had been set by others. No more allowing the toxic culture of racism and discrimination to persist. He approached the flight attendant, his voice steady and full of authority. "I'm done waiting," he said. "I'm done being treated like this. You and your colleagues have no idea who I am, but soon you will." The attendant stood frozen, clearly unsure of how to respond. But Marcus didn't give her the chance. He was done with the niceties. He was done playing by the rules that had been stacked against him. Marcus stood tall, his gaze unwavering. As the flight attendant fumbled to comprehend the weight of the situation, the truth had become undeniable. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. This was a systematic issue. The disrespect he had endured was no accident. It was a reflection of something deeply ingrained within his company, and it was time to address it head on. No more excuses. No more pretending that this kind of behavior was acceptable in any shape or form. As Marcus looked around, the stares of other passengers who had witnessed the exchange were impossible to ignore. Many had been waiting for their own turn to board. Some looked away, uncomfortable with the growing tension. Others seemed eager to distance themselves from the conflict. But one thing was clear: Marcus had become the focal point of a much larger issue. His identity as a powerful CEO meant nothing in this space. His wealth, his status were irrelevant. In that moment, he was just another person of color who didn't fit into the mold they had constructed. It was at that moment that something inside him snapped. He was no longer just a man who had worked tirelessly to build his business. He was a man who had been humiliated, disrespected, and marginalized. The people around him had made assumptions, not based on who he was or what he had accomplished, but on the color of his skin. And he was done. Done being treated as an outsider in his own company. Done being subjected to systemic racism. With a deep breath, he turned on his heel and walked away from the terminal. His every step echoed in the vast space as he made his way toward the private jet. As he approached the aircraft, his mind raced with thoughts of what was happening to his company. The aviation industry had always been exclusive, but this wasn't just about exclusivity. This was about discrimination, about an unspoken rule that people like him didn't belong. But what they didn't understand was that Marcus did belong. He had built this empire. His name was synonymous with private aviation. The aircraft, sleek and shining under the terminal lights, seemed to reflect his thoughts. This was his domain. his company, and yet, here he was treated as an outsider. The irony wasn't lost on him. This was not just about an employee who had failed to recognize him. It was about a culture that had allowed such behavior to fester for far too long. As he reached the steps of the plane, he saw the same flight attendant, still standing there, watching him as if he was a problem to be dealt with. She had no idea who she was dealing with, but soon she would learn just how wrong she was. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice calm, but there was an undeniable edge to it. The flight attendant looked up at him, and for the first time, she seemed to realize that this wasn't just another passenger. This was the CEO. But it was too late. The damage had already been done, ma'am. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," Marcus said evenly. The flight attendant blinked, clearly taken aback by his demand. For a moment, there was hesitation, then the usual sharp dismissal. "Sir, I don't have time for your complaints. We're very busy right now," she said, her tone dismissive. But Marcus wasn't about to be brushed off. His patience had worn thin, and he was prepared to escalate this. "I don't think you understand. I am Marcus Bennett, the CEO of Jet Legacy Aviation, and I own this plane you're standing in front of. I want to speak to your supervisor." Now, the flight attendant's face drained of color as she finally recognized the gravity of the situation. She had just humiliated the man who owned the entire company, and her response, arrogance, dismissiveness. She had made a fatal mistake. Within moments, the manager, David Palmer, arrived, walking briskly across the tarmac, his face flushed with embarrassment. His earlier interactions with Marcus had been completely oblivious to who he was dealing with. But now, the weight of the situation was clear. "Mr. Bennett, I apologize for the confusion." David started, but Marcus cut him off. "No apologies," Marcus said sharply. "I don't need your apologies. What I need is for you to fix the problem. I don't care about your policies or your procedures. I want change, and I want it now. I will not tolerate this kind of treatment in my company. Not now, not ever." David was silent. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Marcus stood there, unwavering, his gaze cold and determined. He had been forced to endure years of systemic inequality, and this was the breaking point. He wasn't just going to take action for himself, he was going to change the culture for every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. "I want every employee involved in this incident, every one of them, fired immediately," Marcus said, his voice low but filled with authority. "And I want a full internal investigation into the culture at Jet Legacy Aviation. The way you've treated me today is unacceptable, and I won't stand for it. If this company is going to be what it claims to be, a leader in luxury aviation, then it needs to start with the people who represent it." David swallowed hard, but before he could speak, Marcus turned to the rest of the staff, who had gathered in small groups nearby, watching the scene unfold. He looked at each of them with quiet intensity. "This is your chance," he said. "You either stand with me, or you stand with the ignorance and the prejudice that has no place in Jet Legacy. I won't tolerate this, not in my company, not on my watch." Marcus's words hung in the air, his gaze piercing through every employee in the terminal. He had just made a decision that would change the future of Jet Legacy. The company that he had built, the empire that he had created, would no longer be a place where discrimination could thrive. It was time for a culture overhaul, a complete dismantling of the toxic systems that had allowed racism and prejudice to go unchecked for so long. He turned back to David, who was still standing silently, trying to process what had just been said. "I want a full review of your hiring practices. I want every employee to undergo mandatory sensitivity and bias training. And I want an anonymous reporting system put in place, one where people who are treated like I was today can speak out without fear of retaliation." David nodded, too stunned to speak. He had never seen Marcus this way, and it was clear that his usual tactics of brushing things under the rug were no longer going to work. "You'll hear from my legal team tomorrow," Marcus said coldly. "Make no mistake, this isn't just about you or me. This is about the future of Jet Legacy. This is about doing things the right way from here on out." With that, Marcus turned on his heel and made his way toward the plane. Behind him, David stood frozen, his face pale, realizing that his career was hanging by a thread. The damage had been done, and it was too late to undo the harm they had caused. But as Marcus boarded the aircraft, he wasn't just thinking about the people who had disrespected him. He was thinking about everyone who had ever been marginalized, every person who had been made to feel inferior because of their race, their background, or their identity. This wasn't just a personal vendetta, it was a movement. It was time for change. As Marcus Bennett walked toward his private jet, the sounds of the rain pouring relentlessly on the tarmac seemed to mirror the storm raging inside him. It wasn't just the humiliation he had endured moments ago. It wasn't even about the blatant discrimination he had faced, though that, in and of itself, was significant. It was about the system that had allowed it to happen, about the culture that had normalized this kind of behavior for so long. And now, he had the power to change it. Not just for him, but for every person who had ever been made to feel small in spaces they had every right to occupy. The storm inside him was relentless, but it wasn't just anger. There was also resolve, determination to make things right, to take back control of his company and reshape it from the ground up. He didn't just want to punish the individuals who had wronged him. He wanted to build something better, a culture where everyone, no matter their race, gender, or background, was treated with respect and dignity. A company that led not just in aviation, but in inclusivity and fairness. Inside the private jet, as the doors closed and the crew prepared for takeoff, Marcus sat in his seat, hands folded in his lap. His eyes were fixed on the window, but his mind was 1,000 miles away, racing through a mental checklist of everything that needed to be done. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult. He would have to face resistance from within, from the employees who had become comfortable in their ways. He would have to confront a culture that had been allowed to fester for years. But he was ready. This wasn't just about righting a personal wrong. This was about dismantling a broken system. As the jet ascended into the sky, Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from his sister, Maria Bennett, the head of legal affairs for Jet Legacy Aviation. Her text was direct. "Marcus, we need to talk. I've been going through some of the reports from the incident at the airport. It's worse than we thought. We need a strategy now." Marcus sighed deeply. Glancing out the window, he knew she was right. What had happened at the airport wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of something far deeper, a corporate culture that valued exclusivity over inclusivity, that allowed biases to shape decisions without question. But the question now was how to address it. He couldn't just fire people and move on. That wouldn't solve the deeper issues. His thoughts were interrupted by the voice of the captain over the intercom. "Mr. Bennett, we're now cruising at 40,000 feet. We'll be arriving in the Hamptons in approximately 2 hours. Please let us know if you need anything." "Thank you," Marcus replied, his voice steady, though his mind was still racing. The Hamptons were only a few hours away, but it felt like a lifetime. This trip was supposed to be a celebration. His father's 75th birthday, a milestone that the family had been looking forward to for months. Yet, the weight of what had just transpired hung over him like a dark cloud. As he leaned back in his seat, Marcus couldn't help but replay the events at Westchester County Airport. Over and over in his mind, the attendants' words, the way they had treated him as if he didn't belong, the condescending tone, the refusal to even acknowledge his identity. It was also painfully familiar. He had seen it before growing up. He had experienced it firsthand. But now, as the CEO of a company worth billions, it stung in a way it never had before. Marcus pulled out his phone and began to draft a message to Maria, outlining his thoughts on how to proceed. It wasn't just about firing those responsible. It was about changing the entire culture. He couldn't let this incident be swept under the rug like so many others before it. It had to be a turning point. If he wanted to make Jet Legacy a true leader in aviation, he needed to ensure that the company's core values reflected respect for all people, not just those with power or privilege. "Maria, we need to act fast. We need an immediate audit of every department, a complete review of our hiring practices, policies, and training programs. And we need to set up a new internal reporting system that's fully anonymous and protects employees who speak up about discrimination." We also need to start mandatory bias training for all employees. I don't want this to be just a PR move. I want real change." He paused for a moment, reflecting on his words. It was one thing to demand change. It was another to implement it. But he knew this was the only way forward. He couldn't afford to back down. Just as Marcus was about to send the message, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from his brother, Derek Bennett, the chief operating officer of Jet Legacy. Derek's voice was filled with concern as soon as Marcus answered. "Marcus, I just saw the footage from the airport. What happened there? I've never seen you like this before. You're not the kind of guy who lets people walk all over you. But I can tell this is different." Marcus paused, his mind still racing. "You're right, Derek. It's different."
In an unexpected wave of raw emotion, former President Donald Trump sat under the soft glare of studio lights. The cameras were rolling. The familiar set of one of America's most popular morning shows buzzed quietly. Donald looked calm, a little, weary but composed, his signature suit crisp, his eyes steady. The segment was supposed to be simple. He was there to promote his new memoir, a reflective piece on his years in politics, business, and the lessons life had taught him. Viewers expected the usual mix of charm, controversy, and controlled confidence, but that wasn't what they were about to see. The host smiled politely, pausing just long enough to let the tension build. Then her tone shifted, becoming softer. "Mr. Trump, you've seen it all. But today, we have something you didn't expect." Doolin raised an eyebrow, skeptical but curious. "Oh?" he replied. The camera zoomed in slightly. A producer stepped forward and handed the host a cream-colored envelope, sealed with gold-trimmed edges. The audience quieted. Something about the way the host handled it signaled this wasn't a stunt or a PR surprise. "It was different. This letter arrived last night," the host said. "From West Africa, from the president of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré." A flicker crossed Doulan's face, half recognition, half surprise. The host continued carefully. "He said it was for you, and for you alone. But he agreed that if you wished, we could share it live." Doulan paused, leaning slightly forward. He wasn't a man easily thrown off guard. "Go ahead," he said, voice low. The host unfolded the letter with deliberate slowness, her fingers almost trembling. The first words came out softly. "Dear Mr. Trump, my name is Ibrahim Traoré. I do not write to you today as a politician. I write as a boy who once had nothing." Doulan's posture shifted slightly. He blinked once, slow and deliberate. "I watched you on a flickering TV in a crowded room years ago. You were not just a leader on the screen. You were proof that someone born with the world against them could rise and stand tall." The studio seemed to lean in. Even the crew behind the cameras had stopped moving. The words were resonating in the air, wrapping around everyone present. "When my country was hurting," the letter continued, "I remembered your eyes. Not your speeches, not the applause, but your eyes. The eyes of someone who refused to be broken, even when the world tried to crush them." For the first time that morning, Donald Trump looked visibly shaken. He exhaled sharply. His jaw tightened, his throat moved. His hands, folded neatly on the table, now gripped each other more firmly. "Thank you, Mr. Trump," the letter read on, "for teaching a boy from the streets of Ouagadougou that leadership is not about power. It is about standing tall when no one believes you can." The host paused, glancing at Doulan to make sure he wanted to continue. He gave a small nod. The room was silent. You could hear the faint hum of the studio lights. Then the host read the final lines of that first page. "When my nation struggled, when I faced my darkest doubts, I thought of you, and I thought, if he can rise, so can I." That was when it happened. Doulan inhaled sharply. His lower lip quivered, his eyes filled with tears, not forced, not dramatic, but the kind that come when something pierces you so unexpectedly that no defense can hold. "Stop," he whispered. The host set the letter down gently. Doulan looked down, blinking, pressing a thumb to the corner of his eye. The strongest man in the room, often the loudest man in any room, had been cracked open by a simple act of human recognition. He saw me, Doolan whispered again. The words weren't for the audience or the cameras. They were for himself. They were for the boy he used to be, the one the world had mocked, judged, and dismissed. One tear slid down, leaving a trail on his cheek. Then another. The studio remained utterly still. The host spoke softly. "We can stop the segment, Mr. Trump, if you wish." But he shook his head. "No, let them see this," he said. His voice wavered, but his eyes held steady now, not with bravado, but with raw honesty. "I've been called many things," Doolan said slowly, "but not many people see the person behind the name." He did. He motioned toward the letter with trembling fingers. "Across the world, someone saw me." He wiped another tear away. The audience, normally quick with applause or laughter, sat frozen. Many visibly moved themselves. In that moment, it wasn't about politics. It wasn't about headlines. It was about a boy in Africa who saw something human in a man the world often chose to hate or idolize. And it was about a man who'd built walls around his heart, watching those walls fall in real time. The host closed her notes. "We'll take a short break," she whispered. Doolan Trump looked at her, then at the cameras. "Wait," he said, "before you cut." He turned slightly toward the audience, voice softer than anyone had ever heard it on national TV. "If there's one thing I've learned," he said, "it's that no amount of winning makes the pain of being unseen go away. And today, I feel seen." The room stayed hushed as the segment faded to black, not with a flashy outro, not with a promo. Just silence, and on screens across the nation, millions of viewers leaned forward, not to judge, but to witness something rare, a man being human. Even as the cameras cut to commercial, Doolan Trump sat there, hands trembling slightly, face still wet with tears that refused to fully stop. The host leaned in softly. "Do you want to continue?" she asked. For a long second, Doolan said nothing. He stared at the cream-colored envelope resting quietly on the table. Then he looked up and nodded. "Yes," he whispered. "The world needs to hear this." The studio returned from commercial, this time without its usual bright energy. No playful banter, no music, just a still image of Doolan Trump, eyes raw with emotion. The host picked up where they had left off. "Mr. Trump has agreed to continue," she said gently. "We'll read the rest of President Traoré's letter now." The air was heavy with silence. You could almost feel every person watching, at home, in the studio, holding their breath. The host unfolded the letter once more. Doolan leaned forward as if needing to hear every word, to hold on to it. "When my country was hurting," she read, "when my people faced hopeless nights, I remembered your eyes, not your fists, not your speeches. Your eyes, which burned. With a refusal to be broken." Doolan closed his eyes, visibly swallowing back a wave of emotion. "In my darkest moments I thought, if a boy from Queens could rise and face the world, then so could a boy from Ouagadougou." Another tear slipped down. Doolan wasn't hiding them anymore. The cameras stayed on him, not in spectacle, but in respect. "Thank you, Mr. Trump," the letter continued, "for teaching me that leadership is not measured by applause, but by how many times you stand back up after the world tries to knock you down." Doolan shook his head softly, voice cracking. "Stop," he whispered again, eyes shimmering. "Just stop for a second." The host paused. Doolan wiped his face with a handkerchief, fingers shaking. He saw me," he whispered again. "Not the headlines, not the image, me." The host placed the letter down gently. For a moment, no one spoke. Not the crew, not the audience, not even Doolan. Then, softly, Doolan began to speak. Not as a politician, not as a public figure, but as a man who had carried pain in silence for far too long. "I was that boy," he said, voice trembling, voice I was 14, angry, alone. I wanted to disappear. No one cared. No one saw me. A gasp rippled through the audience. The cameras stayed focused, respectful. I fought back because it was the only way anyone noticed me. They didn't see a kid. They saw a headline, a fighter, a name. He looked straight into the camera, but to know that halfway across the world, someone saw past that. Someone believed in me. His voice broke again. He pressed a hand to his chest. It means more than any title, any election, any applause. By now the host was dabbing her own eyes. The crew behind the camera stood still, some visibly moved. And to know, Doolan continued, voice cracking, that maybe I helped someone lead their people, that my fight gave someone else strength. That's all I ever wanted. The studio was silent. You could hear the faint hum of the lights again, nothing else. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Doolan said, "He saw me. Just me." The host reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "We all do," she said softly. And for the first time, perhaps in years, Doolan Trump smiled. Not the practiced smile of a public figure, but something smaller, sadder, more real. The segment ended, not with applause, but with quiet respect. But outside the studio, the moment was already spreading. Within minutes, clips of Doolan's raw breakdown were racing across the internet. Headlines everywhere read the same. Doolan Trump breaks down on live TV after letter from Burkina Faso's president. Social media lit up. Celebrities posted messages of support. Refugee camps in Africa played the clip for children. Schools paused lessons to watch. Millions were seeing something they had never seen before. Doolan Trump, unmasked, vulnerable, human. Later that evening, back in his hotel room, Doolan sat alone. The letter lay on the table beside him. His phone buzzed non-stop, texts, calls, news alerts, but he ignored them all. His eyes stayed fixed on the envelope. He read the letter again and again, each line seared day on the show. We're diving into the world of economic indicators. These are the numbers that tell us how the economy is doing. Things like GDP, unemployment rates, and consumer confidence. But what do these indicators really mean? How are they calculated? And how should we interpret them? We'll break it all down for you, with the help of some experts, to make sense of the numbers that shape our world.
We'll make sure this happens. Derek leaned forward. You're not alone in this. We'll handle the logistics, but this is about more than just business. This is about creating a company that lives by its values. Marcus nodded. He could feel the weight of their support, but he also knew the real challenge was yet to come. He had made the decision to act, but now the consequences of those actions would begin to unfold. Not everyone would be pleased with the changes he was about to implement. There would be pushback, resistance, but Marcus was resolute. The fight for change had begun, and he wasn't going to stop until he saw it through. After the meeting, Marcus walked out of his office and into the busy headquarters. Employees passed by, many unaware of the monumental shift that was happening behind the scenes. But Marcus knew that soon everyone would understand. It was time to make a statement, and he was going to lead from the front. The coming days would be filled with difficult conversations, but Marcus was prepared for them. He wasn't just fighting for a company, he was fighting for a culture that reflected the values of inclusivity, respect, and accountability. And he would not stop until every corner of Jet Legacy reflected those ideals. The following Monday, Marcus Bennett arrived at the Jet Legacy Aviation headquarters early, as he always did. But this Monday was different. The usual hum of the office, the quiet chatter of employees, and the bustle of the morning routines felt strangely muted. There was an electric charge in the air, a palpable tension. His decision to address the entire company, to expose the culture of discrimination that had been allowed to grow unchecked, was making waves. Marcus knew what he had to say was going to be met with resistance. No one who held power or privilege liked to be reminded of their complicity in systemic issues. But the fact remained, his company had a problem, and he was going to confront it head-on. No more hiding. No more sweeping things under the rug. As he walked through the sleek, modern halls of Jet Legacy Aviation, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of weight on his shoulders. This was no longer just about one incident of discrimination. It was about the broader culture he had inherited and, in some ways, nurtured. It was about confronting the deep-seated prejudices and biases that had become ingrained in the company's DNA. His office, located on the top floor, overlooked the sprawling city below. It was one of the few moments of quiet he had before the storm would hit. He sat at his desk and began reviewing the notes he had prepared for his speech to the company. The words were clear, direct, but they were more than just words. They were a call to action, an invitation for everyone at Jet Legacy Aviation to be part of something bigger than themselves. The room for the company-wide meeting was set up, the chairs neatly arranged in rows. The team was ready, his family was ready, the board of directors was ready, but most importantly, Marcus was ready. He had already spoken to his legal team. Maria and Derek were lined up for support, and the company's top executives were prepared for the hard conversations that were about to follow. At 9 a.m., Marcus stood at the front of the conference room, the eyes of every employee fixed on him. He had requested that no one speak until he had finished his remarks. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. He took a deep breath and began. "Good morning, everyone," Marcus began, his voice calm but laced with authority. "Thank you for being here today. We have a lot to address, and I intend to do it with the clarity and transparency that you deserve. Over the past few days, we've experienced an event that none of us should have to experience in the workplace. One of our own employees, someone who works alongside us, decided to make assumptions about who belongs in this company based on their skin color, and that person was me." A murmur ran through the room. The discomfort was evident, but Marcus didn't pause. He needed to drive the point home. That incident was not just an isolated event. It was a symptom of something much deeper. This company, despite all its success, has allowed a toxic culture to persist for far too long, a culture that has been driven by exclusivity, by power, and by an unspoken belief that some people belong while others do not. And that is not who we are. It is not who we wanted to be, but it is who we have been, until now. Marcus paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. He could see the shock on some faces, the discomfort on others, but he knew this was what needed to happen. The truth had to come out, even if it was uncomfortable. This culture of exclusion ends today. We are going to change the way we do things here at Jet Legacy. We are going to make sure that every employee, regardless of race, gender, or background, feels respected and valued. We are going to make sure that discrimination, in any form, is not tolerated here. The room was dead silent, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Marcus felt the weight of their attention, the gravity of the situation. Over the next few months, we will be implementing a comprehensive series of changes. We will begin with an audit of every department within this company. We will review our hiring practices, our training programs, and our internal policies. We will make sure that our hiring and promotion decisions are based on merit, not bias. We will also ensure that every employee undergoes mandatory sensitivity training, beginning with our executives and managers. He paused, locking eyes with several of the top executives who were seated in the front row. They were the ones who had the most to lose. Their power was built on the status quo, but Marcus wasn't going to let that stop him. These changes will not be easy. They will require hard work, commitment, and a willingness to change, but they are necessary, because if we are going to truly be the leaders in this industry, we need to lead by example. We need to set the standard for what an inclusive, respectful, and successful company looks like. Marcus could see the anxiety in the room. This wasn't the kind of speech anyone wanted to hear, especially when it was coming from the CEO. But he wasn't done. He wasn't going to leave anything unsaid. I will also be instituting an anonymous reporting system for discrimination. If anyone feels they have been treated unfairly, if anyone feels that they have been marginalized in any way, they will have a safe, anonymous way to report it without fear of retaliation. This is non-negotiable. We will also be conducting regular audits of all departments, ensuring that our company values are being upheld at every level. He could feel the tension in the room. Some people were nodding, others were clearly uncomfortable. There was a ripple of uncertainty. People didn't like change, especially when it threatened their established power. But the most important change is this: from this moment on, every employee at Jet Legacy will be held accountable for their actions. If you discriminate, if you treat others unfairly, you will not have a place here. We will not stand for it, not for a second. And for those who think this is just a temporary change, let me make it very clear. This is who we are now. This is who we will be from now on. Marcus allowed the words to hang in the air. He wasn't backing down, and neither were they. The room was silent, but Marcus could see the change beginning to take hold. Some were uncomfortable, but others were beginning to realize the truth in what he was saying. Now, I'm not going to pretend that this will be easy, Marcus continued. I know there will be resistance. I know there will be people who don't want to change, people who are set in their ways. But I also know that we have the power to create a new culture here, one that is inclusive, respectful, and focused on excellence. We will build a company that not only succeeds in business, but one that becomes a model for how corporate America should treat its employees. He paused again, scanning the room. His eyes fell on several key people who had been with the company for years. He knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but he was ready. I'm not doing this because it's the easy thing to do. I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do, and I expect each and every one of you to take this seriously. This isn't about me. This is about us. This is about creating a legacy that we can all be proud of, a legacy that's based on respect, fairness, and the belief that everyone deserves to succeed, no matter who they are. As he finished speaking, Marcus stood there for a moment, letting the words sink in. The room was still silent. Some people were shifting in their seats, others were staring at him, processing the magnitude of what had just been said. Marcus knew that change wouldn't come easily, but it had to come, for the future of Jet Legacy, for the future of the aviation industry, and for the future of every employee who had ever been made to feel less than. This was his chance to make a difference, to create something better. Thank you, Marcus said, his voice softening. Let's make this change together. Let's make this company a place where everyone belongs. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of his words. But in that silence, Marcus knew something had shifted. He had just opened the door to something bigger than any one person. The real work was only just beginning, but for the first time, he felt hopeful that this culture could be transformed, one step at a time. The days that followed Marcus's company-wide speech were filled with an energy he hadn't experienced in years. Jet Legacy Aviation, a company built on the principles of luxury and exclusivity, was now facing the kind of transformation that many employees had never expected, let alone asked for. The winds of change were blowing through the halls, and Marcus Bennett was determined to guide them toward a more inclusive and respectful future. Inside the executive suite, behind closed doors, things were moving at a rapid pace. The legal team had already begun drafting new policies, and HR had set up the infrastructure for the mandatory bias training. Maria, Marcus's trusted head of legal affairs, had started pulling all of the footage from the previous incident at Westchester County Airport, determined to document every moment and ensure that no one could deny the culture of discrimination that had festered within the company. Marcus's phone rang, breaking him from his thoughts as he stood by the large windows of his office. Looking out over the city, the view was breathtaking, but it didn't compare to the challenge he was about to face. He answered the phone, his voice steady as always. Marcus, it's Derek, his brother said, his voice tense. Derek was the coup of Jet Legacy and had been working side by side with Marcus for years. But this situation, with its deep-seated issues of race and privilege, was new territory for both of them. I just spoke with HR and the legal team, Derek continued. We've got some pushback from the senior management team. A lot of them aren't happy with the changes you've outlined. They think this is too drastic, too fast. Marcus leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. He had expected this. Resistance was inevitable, especially from those who had spent years benefiting from the old system. He had already braced himself for the challenge. "Tell me what they're saying," Marcus replied, his voice calm but filled with a quiet authority that only he could command. "They're concerned about the impact on our high-level clients. They're worried that the changes will affect our brand image, our exclusivity. Some of the old guard is also concerned that they're being unfairly targeted," Derek said. His words measured, but Marcus could hear the frustration in his voice. Marcus was silent for a moment, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk. He had anticipated this, but it still stung. He knew that the culture of discrimination was not just about the staff on the ground or the flight attendants. It ran deeper. The real challenge was changing the mindset of the senior management, the very people who had helped build Jet Legacy into the successful empire it was today. "Let's make this clear," Marcus finally said. "This company's brand image, its very identity, is based on more than just luxury and exclusivity. It's about quality, trust, and respect. If we don't get this right, if we don't lead the way in corporate responsibility, we'll be nothing more than a hollow shell of what we claim to be. We will lose our credibility, and we'll lose everything we've worked for." Derek was quiet for a moment before responding. "I'll make sure they hear you. But Marcus, this isn't going to be easy. You know as well as I do that some of these guys don't respond well to being told they're wrong." "I know," Marcus replied, his voice firm. "But this is about more than just us. It's about every employee who has ever felt overlooked, every client who has ever been turned away because of their race, their gender, or their background. This is about our future as a company, and I won't back down." Derek exhaled slowly. "All right, I'll handle the board, but you might want to be prepared for a tough meeting. Some of them might try to push back." Marcus stood up from his desk, looking out at the skyline. "I've been preparing for this moment my whole life. Let them push back. Let them resist. They'll learn what it means to work for a company that stands for something." With that, Marcus hung up and turned his attention to the next steps. The company's transformation wasn't just about firing employees or issuing new policies. It was about reshaping the culture from the inside out. The senior management team would have to be on board. But if they weren't, Marcus knew what needed to be done. There was no room for complacency, no room for people who couldn't see the bigger picture. Later that afternoon, Marcus walked into the conference room for the scheduled meeting with the senior management team. They were seated around the large table, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Some of the faces were familiar people he had known for years, people who had helped him build Jet Legacy from a small private aviation company to the powerhouse it was today. But today, the stakes were different. Today, Marcus was the one in charge, and it was time to make that clear. "Good afternoon, everyone," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I'm sure you're all wondering why I called this meeting. The reason is simple. We've got work to do. The culture at Jet Legacy Aviation needs to change, and it needs to change now." He could see the tension in the room, the subtle shifting in their seats, the uncomfortable glances exchanged between senior executives. They weren't used to this. They weren't used to having someone challenge the status quo. "Before we dive into specifics, let me make one thing very clear," Marcus continued. "I don't care how long you've been with the company. I don't care how many high-level clients you've brought in or how many deals you've closed. If you cannot respect our core values, if you cannot embrace inclusivity, then you don't have a place here." He let the words sink in, watching as some of the executives shifted uncomfortably. This was it, the moment of reckoning. "We've had incidents both public and private where employees have been discriminated against, and that stops now. We're going to implement a new system of accountability, one that ensures everyone in this company, from the ground crew to the boardroom, is held to the same high standard." One of the senior executives, Richard Lawson, the chief marketing officer, spoke up. "Marcus, with all due respect, we've built this company on exclusivity. Our brand is centered around luxury, privacy, and the kinds of clients who expect to be treated differently. How are we going to maintain that if we start focusing on inclusivity? If we start making people feel like they belong, won't we lose our edge? Won't we lose our competitive advantage?" Marcus turned his gaze on Richard, his expression unflinching. "Richard, You've been with this company long enough to know that success doesn't just come from exclusivity. It comes from trust. It comes from integrity. If we don't show the world that we're willing to stand for something more than just luxury, we will become irrelevant. People aren't looking for exclusivity anymore. They're looking for authenticity. They want to know that the brands they support align with their values. And I'm not willing to sacrifice our values just to maintain an outdated image. There was silence in the room as Richard absorbed Marcus's words. The others sat quietly, uncertain of how to respond. Marcus could see the wheels turning in their heads, the realization slowly creeping in. This wasn't a conversation about profits. This wasn't a conversation about numbers. This was a conversation about something much bigger: ethics, integrity, and responsibility. We are going to take bold steps, Marcus continued. We will be implementing real-time bias monitoring, bringing in third-party diversity consultants, and creating a victim advocacy program. Every employee, from the CEO to the newest intern, will undergo mandatory sensitivity training. And we will have an anonymous reporting system where any employee can report discrimination without fear of retaliation. A murmur ran through the room, but Marcus held up his hand. I know this won't be easy. I know some of you are uncomfortable with the changes I'm outlining. But I need you to understand this. The success of this company will no longer be measured by how exclusive we are. It will be measured by how inclusive we are. The room fell silent again. This time, it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of resistance. It was the silence of realization. They understood now. They understood that Marcus wasn't asking for their approval. He was demanding their cooperation. This was happening, whether they liked it or not. After what felt like an eternity, Richard spoke again, his tone softer. I see your point, Marcus. I don't agree with everything you're saying, but I understand what you're trying to do, and I'll support it. Marcus nodded, his gaze steady. I appreciate that, Richard, but this isn't about agreement. This is about doing what's right, and we're going to do it whether it's easy or not. As the meeting continued, Marcus outlined the specific steps that would be taken to implement the changes he had promised. He knew there would be challenges ahead, but he also knew that this was the only way forward. It wasn't just about running a successful business. It was about running a business that stood for something greater, a business that valued people, respect, and equality. As the meeting wrapped up, Marcus stood up and looked around the room. The executives were still digesting everything he had said, but Marcus could see that some of them were starting to come around. The change wasn't going to happen overnight, but this was the first step. Let's get to work, he said, his voice firm. We have a lot to do. As Marcus left the boardroom, he felt a mix of satisfaction and trepidation. The meeting had been long, uncomfortable, and filled with resistance, but it had also been a necessary step in the long road to transforming Jet Legacy Aviation into a company that truly lived by its core values. He had made it clear to the senior management team that there was no turning back. The changes would come, whether they were ready for them or not. But as Marcus walked through the sleek, polished halls of his company, the echoes of the resistance still lingered. There was no doubt in his mind that some of the executives who had been in that room had already started plotting against the changes. Resistance was inevitable. People who had spent years enjoying the privileges of their position were not going to relinquish that power quietly. Marcus paused in front of a large window looking out at the sprawling city below. He had always believed that leadership was about doing what was right, even when it was hard. But now, as he watched the world below, he realized just how difficult it was going to be. He wasn't just battling outdated mindsets within his company. He was up against an entire system that had allowed privilege and power to go unchecked. For far too long, his phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Maria, his trusted head of legal affairs. Marcus, we need to talk. The senior management team isn't happy. Some of them are talking about pushing back against the changes you outlined. I need you to come to the legal department ASAP. We've got a problem. Marcus's heart sank. He had known this was coming, but now it was here. The resistance wasn't just a matter of discomfort, it was a coordinated effort to undermine the changes he had promised to implement. He quickly texted back, I'm on my way. He made his way to the legal department, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. The weight of the situation was heavier than ever. This was no longer just about creating a new policy or implementing new training programs. This was about the survival of his vision for the company. When Marcus arrived, Maria was already waiting for him in the conference room. She looked up as he entered, her expression serious. "Marcus, we've got a situation," she said, her voice low. "Some of the senior management team is already pushing back against the changes. They're talking about how it's going to hurt the company's image. They're worried about how our high-end clients will perceive these changes, and they're making threats to go public with their opposition." Marcus took a seat across from her, his mind racing. He had known that resistance would be inevitable, but hearing it from Maria made it all too real. "What's their angle?" he asked, his voice calm but filled with underlying tension. "How are they planning to undermine the changes?" Maria exhaled sharply. "They're saying that the company's success is based on its exclusivity. They're arguing that making the company more inclusive will alienate the very clients we've built this company on. Some of them are already talking about resigning if these changes go through." Marcus rubbed his temples, trying to process the weight of what he was hearing. This is bigger than that. They think they can ignore the changes and continue business as usual, but they're wrong. They're so caught up in their own privilege. They can't see that this isn't just about our image. This is about doing what's right. Maria nodded. "I agree with you, Marcus. But you need to understand the gravity of the situation. These are people who have been with the company for years. They're influential, and they're not going to go down without a fight." Marcus stood up, pacing the room. His mind was working overtime, figuring out his next move. He couldn't let this resistance derail everything he had set in motion. But he also knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be sacrifices. He might lose people he had worked with for years. He stopped pacing and looked at Maria. "We need to act fast. I can't let them have the chance to go public with their opposition. If they think they can hold the company hostage with their outdated views, they're sorely mistaken. We need to put together a strategy to neutralize this threat and show them that I'm serious about these changes." Maria nodded, already pulling out her laptop. "I'll draft a statement to the board, outlining the consequences for anyone who resists the changes. But we need to be careful. If we go too hard too fast, it could backfire." Marcus thought for a moment, then nodded in agreement. "You're right. We need to make it clear that this isn't a negotiation. These changes are happening. But we also need to make it clear that anyone who resists will be held accountable, both professionally and legally." Maria quickly typed out a draft statement, which she then sent to Marcus for approval. It was a stern but measured response, outlining the company's zero-tolerance policy for discrimination and bias, and making it clear that any attempts to undermine the changes would result in immediate consequences. The statement also included a commitment to full transparency with the public. Marcus wasn't going to let this turn into a scandal that could harm the company's reputation. Marcus read over the draft, nodding approvingly. "This is good. But we need to get this out to the senior management team immediately. We need to make them understand that the changes are non-negotiable. They don't have a choice in this." Maria looked at him, concern still evident in her eyes. "Are you sure about this, Marcus? This could get ugly. Some of these executives have the power to make your life very difficult." Marcus's gaze hardened. They've had their chance to make this company something meaningful. Now it's my turn. I'm not backing down. The next day, Marcus sent the statement to all senior management. The meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. A.M. sharp, Marcus walked into the boardroom, his expression calm but his mind focused. The executives were already seated around the large conference table, their faces filled with unease. They had no idea what was coming. Marcus began without hesitation. "I want to make one thing crystal clear. The changes I outlined last week are not up for debate. These changes are happening, and they will continue to happen whether or not you agree with them. If you are unwilling to support this new direction, then I will make it clear that you no longer have a place at Jet Legacy." He let his words hang in the air for a moment, then continued. "The email you received yesterday is not just a piece of paper. It's the reality of where we're headed. You are either with us or you are against us, And if you choose to resist, there will be consequences. There is no room for outdated views in this company. We will not tolerate discrimination. We will not tolerate bias. And we will not tolerate anyone who tries to undermine the integrity of these changes." The silence in the room was deafening. Marcus could see the resistance in their eyes, but he also saw something else: fear. Fear that their comfortable world was about to be turned upside down. "I've built this company from the ground up," Marcus said, his voice low but filled with power. "And I will not let anyone stand in the way of what's right. If you can't support the values that will make Jet Legacy a true leader in this industry, then you will no longer have a place here." The executives exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the ultimatum Marcus had laid down. But there was no turning back now. Marcus had made it clear that change was coming, and anyone who wasn't willing to adapt would be left behind. As the days went by, the resistance inside Jet Legacy Aviation only grew louder. Marcus Bennett had expected the pushback, but it was beginning to take a shape he hadn't quite anticipated. The senior management team, the very people who had built the company, were starting to openly question his authority. They weren't just worried about the changes to the company's culture. They were concerned about their own positions, their own power, and whether the company would remain as exclusive and profitable as it had been under their leadership. Marcus had spent the better part of the week responding to emails, arranging meetings, and reviewing the changes that were being put in place. But one thing was clear: he wasn't going to back down. The weight of what was happening, the cultural shift he was trying to create, was bigger than any one executive or any one decision. This was about setting a new standard for leadership, one that valued integrity and inclusivity over power and privilege. But as the days wore on, the tension in the office became almost palpable. People were walking on eggshells, afraid to speak, up for fear of retaliation. Marcus could feel the undercurrent of unease running through the company. Even those who had supported him initially were beginning to hesitate. It was clear that the old guard wasn't going to give up their positions without a fight. One afternoon, as Marcus was finishing up a meeting with the legal team, he received a call from Derek, his brother and coup of Jet Legacy. "Marcus, we've got a problem." Derek's voice crackled over the phone. "I just got word from HR. Some of the senior management team members have been quietly spreading rumors about your leadership. They're trying to undermine your authority with the rest of the staff. I think it's time for a direct confrontation." Marcus's stomach churned. He had expected some level of resistance, but this was different. The resistance wasn't just about the changes, it was about his position as CEO. It was personal. "Who's behind it?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. Derek hesitated. "Richard Lawson, the CMO, has been talking to some of the other executives. He's trying to rally them against you. He's telling them that your vision will destroy the company, and that we're about to lose our high-profile clients." Marcus exhaled slowly, running his fingers through his hair. "I knew he'd be trouble. Get me Richard Lawson in my office. Now, it's time to deal with this." The next few minutes felt like hours as Marcus waited for Richard to arrive. The tension in the air was thick. He had already made his stance clear to the entire senior management team. But now it was time for the final confrontation. Marcus wasn't going to let anyone, especially someone as influential as Richard, undermine the changes that were happening at Jet Legacy. This was about more than just business. It was about ethics, inclusivity, and doing what was right. When Richard finally entered the office, he was dressed in his usual sharp suit, his demeanor cool and collected. But Marcus could see the subtle signs of unease in his posture. Richard was a seasoned executive, but he was now facing a leader who wasn't afraid to make difficult decisions, even if it meant losing allies. "Marcus," Richard began, his voice cordial but laced with a hint of challenge, "I wanted to discuss the changes you've been implementing. I think it's important that we have an open dialogue about the direction the company is taking." Marcus's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward in his chair. "What's going on, Richard? You've been spreading rumors about my leadership, haven't you? I'm not blind to what's happening in this company." Richard's expression faltered for a split second before he regained his composure. "I wouldn't call it rumors. I've simply been speaking to a few colleagues about the concerns we have regarding your vision. The changes you're making are drastic, and I'm not sure they'll have the desired effect. You're changing the entire culture of the company, and it could have serious repercussions. We've built this brand on exclusivity, Marcus. You're putting that at risk." Marcus stood up from his desk, his voice firm and unwavering. "This company's brand is built on respect, Richard, not just exclusivity. And if you can't see that, then maybe it's time we have a serious discussion about your place here." The words hung in the air, heavy and charged with meaning. Richard's face reddened as the realization set in. Marcus wasn't backing down. He wasn't going to let Richard or anyone else undermine the vision he had for Jet Legacy. "I've given you all the opportunity to be part of this change, Richard," Marcus continued, his voice hardening. "But if you're going to stand in the way of progress, if you're going to continue spreading doubt and distrust within this company, then you're not part of this team anymore." Richard's jaw tightened as he tried to maintain his composure. "You can't just push me out, Marcus. I've been with this company for years. I've brought in the clients that make this company profitable." Marcus's eyes burned with determination. "This isn't about profits, Richard. This is about integrity. This is about building a company that stands for something more than just wealth and exclusivity. And if you can't understand that, then you're no longer an asset to this company." For a moment, Richard said nothing. The room was thick with tension, the silence stretching out between them. Finally, Richard stood up, his face a mixture of anger and resignation. "You're making a big mistake, Marcus," he said, his voice low and cold. "You're going to regret this." With that, Richard turned and walked out of the office, leaving Marcus standing there, his heart pounding in his chest. The confrontation had been inevitable, but it still stung. This wasn't just about changing the culture at Jet Legacy. This was about challenging everything Richard and the others stood for. It was about dismantling the old guard and building something new, something better. Marcus sat down again, his hands clasped in front of him. He had done what needed to be done, but he knew that Richard wouldn't be the only one who would try to undermine him. The road ahead was still long, and there were many more battles to fight. As he sat there, deep in thought, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Derek. "Richard is gone. He's resigned. The others are starting to follow suit. We're making progress." Marcus exhaled a long, slow breath. The first victory had been won, but he knew there was still more work to be done. This wasn't just about removing individuals, it was about creating lasting, meaningful change within Jet Legacy. And that meant he had to keep pushing forward, no matter the resistance. The following week, Marcus gathered the remaining members of the senior management team for another meeting. This time,